LinkedIn presents.
If you're ever in the mood to be grossed out, go on YouTube and search for videos of soccer superstar Lionel Messi throwing up.
He was seen vomiting multiple times on the pitch during games.
A surprising number of sports fans / armchair gastroenterologists have tried to figure out why the Argentinian forward was once so prone to losing his lunch. The answer, it turns out, is pretty simple. Messi had stage fright, so bad that it made him hurl. If you've experienced stage fright yourself, then you know it can be debilitating. Three-time Oscar winner Daniel Day-Lewis once got it so bad during a production of Hamlet that he walked off the stage mid-scene and never returned. To experience stage fright is to feel stuck in the mud with an anchor wrapped around your ankles. And that's a hard feeling to overcome. The Hamlet incident with Daniel Day-Lewis was more than 30 years ago, but he hasn't acted in a play since. Lionel Messi, on the other hand, has found a way to get unstuck. He figured out how to calm his nerves, settle his stomach, and put one foot in front of the other. His hack? He puts one foot in front of the other, just very, very slowly. For the first few minutes of every game, Messi doesn't sprint after the ball. He wanders around the field at such a leisurely pace that he looks, as one commentator observed, to have the dreamy purposelessness of a flaneur. But of course, it's not purposeless. Those strolls around the pitch keep his heart rate down and his anxiety at bay. It's a coping mechanism, a trick he's devised to overcome the nervousness that might otherwise sideline him. And it has another benefit as well. By taking it slow, pausing before he plays, Messi has time to study his opponents, suss out their weaknesses he can then exploit.
Messi. Oh. Messi!
Are you kidding me? A work of art! This man is absolutely mainline to pure footballing magic!
Messi has scored more than 800 goals in his 19-year career. He's won 3 Championship League titles. Last summer, he led Argentina to victory in the World Cup. Many consider him to be the greatest soccer player in history. Achieving all that was only possible because he came up with a way to get unstuck. He developed a simple tool that helped him realize his full potential. Which begs the question, what if you could do something similar? I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, how to get unstuck when it matters most. To be alive is to battle stuckness. So declares NYU marketing professor Adam Alter in his new book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough. What is stuckness? It's the inability to move forward with something you care about. It's the unease you feel when you're stalled. It's the maddening realization that whatever you're doing to try to make progress, it's not working. We've all been there. Stuck in a dead-end job, stuck in an unhappy relationship, stuck on a project, stuck. But after surveying the latest research in psychology and economics, Adam Alter cracked the code on stuckness. He's fashioned a bunch of science-backed tools that you can use to get out of your funk and on with what matters. Because while getting stuck is inevitable, staying stuck does not have to be.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Adam Alter, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Rufus.
This new book of yours, which comes out next week, just 2 days before we're dropping this episode, I think it's going to do exceptionally well because it's incredibly useful, actionable. It's full of colorful, inspiring stories. And at its heart, it's deeply humane. It's kind of sympathetic, I think, to the human condition. The subtitle is How to Get Unstuck When It Matters Most. And I think it kind of assumes that most all of us do get stuck. And yet we look around and we see people who appear to be rollerblading through life, right? Do you think it's safe to assume that even those people get stuck with some frequency?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, that today all you see is people rollerblading through life. And the result of that, whether it's social media or whether it's just that whatever you see is the polished end product of a lumpy process, you tend to assume that other people are having an easier time than you are. But everyone is stuck in some way, and they all feel that they're alone in that stuckness.
So why do we get stuck? It seems like it's somewhat built into the human condition. I guess part of it, you explain, is this goal gradient effect.
Yeah, the basic idea is that for any extended process where you're aiming for a long-range goal, there will be a period in the middle where you'll probably experience a lull. And it doesn't matter whether you're a charitable organization seeking donations, whether you are trying to write 100,000 words of a book, it really doesn't matter what you're doing. The lull happens in the middle, and it also often happens at the beginning as well when we first get started, that we start slowly. And it's not until you can see the goal in sight that you start to ramp up your effort and your attention. And then you start to move a little bit more quickly. That's one of the major reasons why we get stuck.
And we see this, you point out, in mice in mazes, right? Like very consistently, right? The mice, they start off and they're excited. This is a new challenge. And then they get a little bit discouraged. And once the goal is within sight, they accelerate. We're not too dissimilar.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting similarities between humans and lower order animals. And that's one of the major ones with respect to goals and with respect to getting stuck. Another one is that we tend to hit plateaus. So if you do something for long enough, you will tend to find that the returns on whatever you've been doing decline to the point where you've got to do something new. And that's true for other animals as well.
And so what do we do about these problems?
Well, I think of the kind of stuckness that I'm interested in the book is the kind that is open to a shift in strategy or that can be worked on. So there are processes that would allow us, I think, to truncate them, to shorten them, and perhaps to dull them as well, to shrink their magnitude or their amplitude. And I think a lot of the strategies in the book are designed exactly for that, to hasten the process of moving through those towards a breakthrough.
A decent portion of the solutions to getting stuck addressed in the book are about innovation and creativity and how to find new solutions, which is something we all struggle with. And I was fascinated by this evidence that people tend to mistakenly think that our best ideas come early in the process. And it feels like that may be because we have this sort of mythology that creativity is something miraculous, that maybe there's a certain subset of humans who are these highly creative humans, and they have this gift. And that gift presents itself, right, with this sort of creative revelation. You call this sort of the insight lens, aha moments versus a production lens, this idea that creativity is the outcome of hard work. Do you think that's right? I mean, do you think that there's a perception problem about kind of what the creative process is or should be?
As a scientist, I think one of the big problems that humans face in general is that we think of things that are actually grounded in something quite mechanical and algorithmic as being mystical, as though they come from nowhere. Yeah. And that's problematic because it makes it seem like you don't have a lot of agency in the world. And stuckness is one of them broadly, but I think narrowly you're talking about creativity, and it's the same issue that this insight lens suggests that creativity is just basically a God-given gift. It essentially either lands on you or it doesn't to a large extent. And when you look at people who are known for being creative, a lot of them have a process. They don't just sit around and then like a bolt of lightning hits them and they say, oh, okay, I've got this great idea. They have a process and they spend a huge amount of time that you don't see going through the motions before those ideas come. Now, every now and again, there is a eureka effect. That doesn't mean that never happens. But for the rest of us who don't have many eureka effects, and that's most of us, there are other ways to generate creative ideas. And that's what I think a lot of people find quite liberating when they understand it.
I have kind of a pet theory, Adam, that genius is a word that we use to describe mental processes that we don't understand. And that often what we see as genius is required tens of thousands of hours of practice and work. It seems that there's a lot of evidence that the reality is much more exciting than that everyone has access to these tools. And a big part of what makes this process accessible, it seems to me, having read your book, is that we need to persist through the creative process. That if it feels hard, you're doing something right. It's appropriate that it would feel challenging to generate the next idea and the next idea and the next idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So this idea that when things get hard, our creativity is likely to start declining, that's a very intuitive idea, and it's absolutely backward. It's not just that when things get hard, you continue to do okay. It's that when things get hard, you tend to lift off and blast off into the atmosphere. And that's when the good stuff happens, because those first, say, 3 or 4 ideas when you're trying to solve some sort of puzzle. There's one example is the creative uses task. How many different uses can you come up with for a paperclip or something like that? The first 5 ideas you have, everyone else has those ideas, and they come easily to you and they come easily to everyone. And so they're not that interesting.
Yeah.
But as it starts to get harder, you tend to diverge from the herd, and that's when idiosyncrasies pop out. Your special way of approaching the problem pops out. And so, yes, it's getting more difficult. Maybe the ideas take a little bit longer to tumble out of your head. But when they emerge, they are genuinely novel and interesting and different. And that only happens when things get hard. And so you have to wait till that moment when they start to get more difficult.
There's a line in the book from psychologist Brian Lucas. It's hard to train people to believe that mental difficulty is a sign of progress rather than stagnation. So I imagine that's something that once that's been positively reinforced, we start to recognize that as like, hey, this is something that has worked in the past and will work again.
Exactly, yeah. It's brilliant work by Brian and by Lauren Nordgren. This paper they have, and a series of papers actually, on the creative cliff illusion, this idea that your creativity falls off a cliff once things start getting hard. And that's just not true. As I said, not only do you not fall off a cliff, but you soar into the atmosphere, and that's when the good stuff happens. So yes, once that's happened a few times, and creatives will tell you this as well, that they'll develop a sense that turns out the difficulty of the process doesn't mean that things are going badly. It turns out it means they're going well.
This advice to be persistent and to push through the headwinds and the challenges, does this also apply to being persistent over many, many years as you're trying to innovate or build a product or advance your career?
It does. I mean, obviously, there are 2 things you can do in any moment when things get hard. You can persist, or you can quit, or you can move on. And I think anyone who says you should always quit is wrong, and anyone who says you should always persist is wrong. And so the question is, how do you know whether you should do one or the other? In the book, I make the case for persisting. I've always studied these ideas through a lens of asking whether difficulty predicts that you should stop, and I don't think it does. I think difficulty means that you should probably continue for a bit longer. But if you're working on a business or some long-term project, one of the questions you can ask yourself is, what else could I be doing or should I be doing with my time and energy and resources? And if I'm converging on whatever goal I have, with respect to a company, it might be a certain number of subscribers, it might be revenue, it might be raising a certain sum of funds. It doesn't really matter what your goal is. If you're converging on that over time, you're getting closer and closer to the mark, then you should persist. But if at some point, for a considerable period of time, you notice that you're diverging from the goal, it might be time to consider what your alternatives are. And John List, the economist at the University of Chicago, talks a lot about the idea that quitting is often a good idea because there's opportunity cost in everything you do. You could always be doing something else, and that menu of alternatives is endless. But I tend to think that once you're really focused on something, assuming you're focusing on the right thing, that you came to that thing with logic and reason and with some good ideas, then you should probably persist a fair amount before you decide to move on. Certainly longer than perhaps intuition would tell you.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are 2 books that we've covered at the Next Big Idea Club that take the polar positions on this, right? There's famously Grit by Angela Duckworth, which, right, is the sort of the gospel of persistence.
Right.
And on the other side, there's a wonderful book called Quit, The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away by Annie Duke. And we had a great conversation with Annie about the case that she made, which she made persuasively, I thought, was that we have a culture that is obsessed with persistence. And that if anything, we err too far in the direction of kind of blind persistence. Although my guess is if she were on the talking with us now, that she would probably concur that part of it is that we often persist in the wrong ways, that what you lay out are all the ways to modify and incrementally adjust one's experimentation and process to persist in the right ways, that's kind of where the rub is. And in some cases that can result in pivots and very meaningful changes to the product you're building or to the business you're building.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, fully 9 chapters of the book are about, okay, so now you've decided not to quit. What do you do next? And so it's a strategic application of energy in a certain direction, doing certain things strategically. But yeah, I agree with you that Annie and Angela are far too intelligent and nuanced in the way they write and think to hold those polar positions without acknowledging that they don't always apply. And I have heard both of them speak about when you don't do what the book essentially says and you have to at times deviate. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
That's right. And one-word titles are effective, right?
They
are.
Yes.
it's hard to get all the nuance in the title typically. Something that fascinates me as someone who's been building, digital media companies now for 25 years is that you have among the variables when you decide like, hey, we're going to persist, duration equals success, as you say, like time is your friend. We're going to keep at this. I think it's useful to note that there are kind of two variables as you're persisting in some kind of in building something and in creating something. One is one's own efficacy, one's own success in iterating a product, in creating what you aim to create and testing. But the second is the evolution of the marketplace as a whole, right? That you have, new technologies are emerging. The cultural and economic context is changing, right? Trends are a big variable, right? I think more so than people realize, like the trend of listening to podcasts, for which we're grateful. You think of I think back on MTV and how there was this sudden revelation that, really every song should be accompanied by a video, and the best way to listen to music is while watching a video, right? There was everybody did that for 5 years, and then it was sort of, and of course it still exists, but not in the same way. And as you point out, we're talking about sort of mythologies that are sometimes detrimental, and we have this perception of kind of first mover advantage. But as you point out, Facebook followed Friendster and MySpace and other social media platforms. There were other businesses selling books online before Amazon. I had friends who started video platforms like YouTube before YouTube. But they, but theirs was not the one that won. And for somewhat sort of arbitrary reasons, Google, you point out, was the 22nd search engine. So it does seem like the benefits of persistence are both finding the right timing, finding the right market timing and sort of cultural moment and the right technologies and the right situation to be successful, as well as incrementally improving one's process.
Yeah, exactly. I think we privilege radical originality and this idea that this thing that I'm doing has to be first and completely new and completely different from what came before. And that's in business, but also in creativity in general, whether it's music or film or art, it doesn't matter what it is. I think that when we overemphasize radical originality, we lose sight of the fact that often you can do something that others have done. The way Google did as the 22nd search engine, if you do it better and you evolve instead of try to strive for revolution, you tend to do much better. And so a lot of the time when I'm teaching MBA students about new products, we talk about this myth of the radically original product. And we look at products that people often say are radically original, and then we say, well, actually, if you look closely, this wasn't first. Everything stands on the shoulders of something else, whether it's a giant or whether it's not. It's standing on some other thing. And so evolution is the key. And that really changes the way you approach creative pursuits, whether in business or otherwise.
Could you tell us about optimal distinctiveness?
Yeah, so optimal distinctiveness is this notion in psychology that you want things like, for example, the names you give kids to be just a little bit different from what everyone else is doing, but not so different that when people hear the name, they really struggle to grapple with it. They don't understand what it is. You've got to ask people 10 times to explain how to pronounce it and how to spell it. And this is true of cultural products in general. So the best art, for example, and when I say best, I mean most commercially successful and generally most celebrated.
Yes.
Is not like 10 steps removed from what was happening before. It's 1 or 2 steps removed. It's optimally distinctive. In other words, it's the right amount of different. And the right amount of different is maybe modestly to moderately different, but not extremely different, and certainly not the same, because then it's redundant. And so it's a very powerful idea that cuts across lots and lots of different contexts in how humans perceive the goodness of things in the world. They like things that are just a little bit different.
Yes. There's a wonderful section in Derek Thompson's book, Hitmakers. I don't know if you read that one.
Yes. Yeah,
about
I know it well.
The science of popularity. Wonderful book. He talks at length about how we're attracted to the familiar.
Mm-hmm.
That they've done studies with kids in art history classes where they'll show them a series of slides of art and repeat some of them. And whatever they repeat, later the students end up liking better. For whatever reason, we like the familiar. But we also like a pinch of novelty, right? And so it seems that so much of what ends up resonating are largely familiar things with a kind of surprising burst of originality or surprise, of novelty. And I think of the Broadway show Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. I saw it twice. I don't know if you saw Hamilton. Mm-hmm. But it's in so many ways actually a classic Broadway show. But some of the songs are hip-hop songs. And so the twists and the surprise there made it one of the most successful musicals in the history of the world. And I think the perception is that it's radically new. But in fact, if you dig in, that's not the case.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's the perfect example of taking two elements that themselves are not new. Hip hop's not new, and Broadway shows aren't new. But when you merge them in a way that is new, you create something that is optimally distinctive. It's just different enough that it really captures a big audience. I mean, obviously on top of that, he's tremendously talented.
Oh, yes.
And,
yes, absolutely.
And it's a brilliant product. But I think it does benefit from that recombination or repackaging of existing ideas that people feel comfortable with.
Yes, exactly. No, in no way do we mean to subtract here from the genius of Lin-Manuel and the whole team at Hamilton. They're spectacular.
Yeah.
Word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came. And the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
Let's talk about reducing anxiety, which, as you point out, when we're dealing with crises and situations in which we're stuck, for most all of us, anxiety is going to be present, and working through that and managing that anxiety is a big factor. And it's really kind of reassuring to read all these stories about these high performers, these extraordinarily talented people who have incredibly pronounced anxiety, right? I didn't know this history of the legendary soccer player Messi, some would say the greatest soccer player ever to play the game, who vomited repeatedly before games. He sometimes vomited on the field, right? Because he was so anxious. And this seems to be something we should expect.
Yeah, there's a sort of myth that the highest performers don't have anxiety, that anxiety is reserved for the rest of us, for the sub-elites in a sense. And that's just not true. Some of the highest performers are quite anxious. And when that happens, when you feel stuck in whatever it is you're doing, in the case of Messi, for example, he was a tremendous talent, but a lot of his coaches when he was young said he's just too nervous. He's so anxious about the game, even games that aren't that important, that how is he going to play the big games? How is he going to compete with the best players? And so he learned to turn down the temperature by spending the first few minutes of every game, which he continues to do now, just ambling around. He sort of walks, not quite aimlessly, but he saunters around the center of the field, watching all the other players, and that has two two effects that are quite beneficial. One of them is it calms him down, gives him a few minutes to catch his breath and get used to the fact that he's on the pitch, and lowers the temperature of the moment. But the other thing it's doing that's tremendously valuable, and I think it explains in part why he's so good, is it gives him a moment to survey the territory and to look at what everyone else is doing, how they're performing, whether there are any idiosyncrasies. Is someone perhaps injured that no one knew about? Are there two players on the opposing team who are connecting particularly well? And he'll take the information he gets in those first few minutes and use it through the rest of the 85 plus minutes of the game. And so what you see when you look at Messi's goals, he scored goals in every single minute of the game except minutes 1 and 2, because in effect, he isn't yet playing the game.
Another great example of an initially anxious, enormous talent is the pianist Herbie Hancock, right? There's this wonderful story in the book about he's going in to audition for Miles Davis.
Yeah, I love that story. And I love that there's video footage of Hancock explaining this experience.
Oh my gosh. Oh, I've got to see that.
You got to check it out. There's a YouTube video, an interview where he's explaining what it was like to audition with Davis and his band. And he went to Davis's house and he walked in, and some of the greatest giants of jazz were there, and they were all these musicians that he was going to be playing with. And it was an audition, and it was pretty formal, and it was a 3-day long process. And Miles was there, and Miles welcomed him in. And obviously, Miles Davis was well known for being incredibly hard on his musicians. Even on stage during a performance, if he didn't like something they were doing, he would glower at them, or he'd tell them to get off stage, or he'd force them to redo whatever they'd just done. And so they knew that he was a real hard ass. He was difficult to deal with. So he welcomed Hancock in, and Hancock knew of Davis' reputation. He was very nervous, and they started jamming. And within a few minutes,
Miles threw his trumpet on the couch, and then he ran upstairs.
And so Hancock figured, all right, it took 5 minutes for Miles to figure out that I didn't belong, that I'd effectively bombed. But that's when he started enjoying himself. That's when Herbie was like, you know what, how many opportunities am I going to get to play with these giants? Let me just enjoy myself. I'll have some fun. And he relaxed. He started playing differently. 3 days later, at the end of the process, Miles comes down the stairs with his trumpet, and he starts jamming again with everyone else. And he says to Hancock at the end of this process,
okay, next week we're going to meet at 1:30 at Columbia Recording Studios. And I said, Miles, does that mean I'm in the band? Miles looked at me and had this kind of gleam in his eye, but he said some expletive, and then he said, "You're making the record."
And Hancock was absolutely floored by that. And he said, well, I just assumed I'd bombed. And Miles said to him, no, I knew you were nervous. You were green. You were young. I had to get out of here. So I listened in on the intercom for the last 3 days, and I could hear that you were flourishing when I wasn't around. So he knew just when to turn down the temperature.
He knew that we were going to be nervous with him around. So he wanted to hear us, unencumbered by that kind of fear, which was fantastic and very compassionate of him to do that, But that's the kind of person that Miles was.
That's perfect leadership.
Yes.
Figuring out when to be the hard ass that you tend to be dispositionally, and when to turn down the temperature. And Davis did that very well. And not just with Hancock, but there are stories of other musicians, John McLaughlin, the guitarist as well.
As we think about how to deal with anxiety ourselves, right? Not in management situations, but just as individuals, one solution is what's called radical acceptance, which I understand as just embracing the worst case scenario. This, you say, you have found to be empowering.
Yeah, I found it tremendously empowering. It's an idea that's grounded in Eastern philosophy and Buddhism. Its main practitioner is a woman named Tara Brach. And she talks about the idea of a sacred pause. She basically says that when things get hard, you've got to take a minute just coming to grips with it before you do the next thing, whatever the next thing is, strategically or behaviorally. And part of that is accepting where you are. She doesn't say you have to accept that things are going to be like that forever.
Yeah.
But you have to accept where you are before you can move on to fixing it, doing the next thing. And sometimes if it can't be fixed, it can't be fixed. But when it can, you will be in a far better position to fix it if you first accepted that it is where it is right now.
And I found in my own life that picturing in my mind the worst case scenario, thinking it through and concluding that it's acceptable or embracing it as something I can live with is game changing. I remember when I started my first company in my 20s, my mother said to me, how can you take this risk? Why can't you, get a proper job at a larger company? This is crazy. What are you doing? I said, Mom, if it fails, I will get a job at a coffee shop and, read a lot of books. I mean,
there you go.
which to me is a perfectly delightful scenario. I've always sort of had the sense that, like, as long as we have our health, that really most scenarios I could live with. The most radical version of this is that when I'm on an airplane and there's severe turbulence, like a lot of people, I get pretty nervous, and I've just decided to say, you know what? I've made peace with the idea that I'm not going to make it through this flight. It's been a great life. It's been a great ride. And then the wheels touch down and I'm like, hallelujah. It's a totally
it's a bonus.
So there's actually two things happening there, right? There's sort of like making peace with mortality and a truly radical acceptance of worst case scenarios.
I play the revocability game, which is basically where you say to yourself, this thing that I'm about to do, whether it's starting a new company or a career change or starting a new research project, if you're an academic, whatever it might be, is it something you can undo? Can you walk back from it? Can you shift? Can you pivot back?
Yeah.
And almost always, even if there's some friction, the answer is yes. Most things, not everything, but most things you can undo to a large extent. And that's very freeing if you're worried about the idea that you're moving down a particular path and there's just no coming back from that decision.
Yes, absolutely. With the exception of plane crashes, which can't be undone.
But you did give one example that deviated from that plan.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z General Partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. Why should we strive for excellence rather than perfection?
If you strive for perfection, it's a standard that is so incredibly high and stringent that you're very unlikely to reach it. And that itself is going to be paralyzing. And you're going to continue to live your life according to this kind of binary where either you're not perfect or you are. And since we're so rarely, if ever, perfect, you're essentially living eternally in a state of failure. A better way to go is to say, what would be considered an excellent performance? How will I know if I've performed excellently? And in most domains, it's not that falls short of perfection, but it's a different way of couching performance. You set benchmarks that mean something to you, and you strive for those benchmarks. And the nice thing about excellence is it's a little more forgiving. And if you fall just shy of excellence, it's still extremely good. Whereas short of perfection it's just not perfect. And so it's a very helpful reframing of the way to think about what you should be striving for in any domain of performance.
And you say, I guess, on this journey towards excellence, we should lower our standards. This is contrarian advice.
Yeah, I think it is contrarian advice, but that is something that I think is valuable. The problem with those very high standards is that they are paralyzing, and if you're stuck, they will only entrench you further. But if you lower your standards just a bit, I'm not saying they have to always be at the floor, but if you lower them a little bit and you clear them, you clear those standards, you clear the hurdle you've set, then you can certainly set new ones. This isn't just a one-time deal. But to get the ball rolling again, especially when you're stuck, when you're mired, it's very helpful to have some action under your belt. And so you've got to push yourself a little bit. And that's more likely to happen when your standards are not astronomically high. And there's a huge amount of evidence for that starting with standards that are modest is a good way to go.
And then we can raise them incrementally, right, as we're seeing progress. And
exactly.
So we can perhaps arrive at a higher set of standards, having started with a lower set of standards. I think that's very appealing. Well, you spoke earlier about the power of pausing and how when we're overwhelmed, often the best thing to do is pause. To me, one of the most dramatic examples of this, there are quite a few, is the example of Chuck Yeager and early high-altitude flight. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah. So this is one of the many paradoxical ideas that came up as I was putting the book together. And the paradoxical idea here is that the best thing you can do when you're starting to get unstuck, the best first thing you can do is nothing. And that's because you basically have to stop and take stock and figure out what you want to do before you do the next thing. This extreme example that you mentioned is Chuck Yeager talking about what it's like when you stall at high altitude flight. So if you fly a plane very, very high where the atmosphere is very thin, the plane will stall and it'll start to dive towards the earth. And Yeager has talked about the fact that when that happens, your first instinct as a pilot is to yank wildly at the yoke and to try to figure out how you're going to change the orientation of the plane and to regain control. But actually, the best thing you can do is to let the plane plummet to the point where the atmosphere is thicker, and then you will regain control. But the more you wrestle with the yoke, the more you're going to cause problems. And a lot of the pilots actually crashed in that process. But Yeager talked about the fact that the thing that saved him was that he passed out. And so by definition had to pause. He could not yank at the yoke. He couldn't do anything because he was not conscious at that moment. And he talked about the realization that by being incapacitated, by being forced to do nothing, he learned that the best thing he could do when he was actually conscious was the same thing, which was to do nothing. And so he trained himself to actively do nothing for a bit before it started to make sense to act again. So that was a really sort of extreme example of the importance of what I call pausing before you play.
Yes. I guess getting knocked unconscious is a very dramatic way of learning to pause.
It is.
But hopefully the rest of us won't need quite as dramatic of a set of circumstances to see the benefits of pausing. You know, there's a wonderful study that you cite on the impact of pausing in negotiations, which I think concludes that negotiations in which there's a 3 to 12 second pause between the people negotiating tend to result in better outcomes for both parties. And I think the researchers who were studying this then instructed two groups of people to, the non-control group was instructed to insert sustained pauses into the negotiation, and the effect held. They were more successful negotiations. That's so interesting. I wonder why that is. I wonder if it's about human connection occurring in those pauses or just slowing the process down.
Yeah, it's a really interesting study. And I think there are two different versions of it that you've pointed out that I think are both very important. One is that people who naturally take pauses are better at this. You know, if you have a team of negotiators and they happen to just generally take more time between responding, that's a good thing. That leads to better outcomes for everyone. Essentially, the negotiation pie is enlarged for both parties. But you can also engineer this. So it's not just natural talent for pausing. It's that when you inject artificial pauses into the process, you get benefits. But you're right. I mean, there are different interpretations of why that might be beneficial. It might be that strategically it takes time for your brain to get around what the best next course is. And if you just start speaking, you start acting before you've paused, you may not have time to fully get your head around your options. It might also be something about just the way communication operates, that pauses signal to another person that you're thinking carefully and deeply. They might take you more seriously. They may form a stronger connection with you socially, which might improve the tenor of the negotiation, which then leads to an enlarging of the pie. There are a few different things that could be going on, but all of them beneficial and all of them arise from that act of pausing.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a way to communicate that one is listening.
Exactly.
There's a bit of an expression of humility maybe in the pause. You know, getting back to this theme of kind of this idea that getting stuck is part of the process of doing the extraordinary things we all want to do. If I had to pick a single favorite data point in the book, it would be this, that researchers conducted a study on the perfect success to failure ratio. I'm imagining this is perhaps like people learning a new instrument or a new language, making errors as they go. And it turns out that the optimal error rate is 15.87% failures. Very precise, right? So like 1 in 6 attempts at whatever one is trying to do result in failure, which is to say, fewer failures, one is learning less effectively. More failures, one is learning less effectively. This is sort of optimal failure rate, 1 in 6. Isn't that fascinating? And it suggests that we none of us wants to fail all the time, but we do need to fail, and we need to embrace that as part of the process.
Yeah, I think obviously the precision of that number to 2 decimal points suggests a level of precision that's probably not evident in the actual data. That things vary a fair amount, and the main thing to take away, as you've said, is that you need to fail to an extent. Maybe it's 1 in 6 times, maybe it's 1 in 7, maybe it's 1 in 5. But you should be failing a bit. You certainly shouldn't be failing 50% of the time when you're doing all these things that you've described, learning a new instrument, learning a language. If you fail too much, it's demotivating and you don't learn either. But if you fail too little, as we've said in the past in our discussion, that's also problematic because you just don't grow. You need those occasional failures to signal that things are shifting and changing and that you're learning something new. And you can't do that if you're not failing.
Yeah, it's feedback.
It is.
I was fascinated by what we've learned from college basketball teams who have easy preseason schedules versus college basketball teams that have difficult ones.
Yeah, this is some of my own research. A team of us wanted to investigate whether it was a good thing to have a hard preseason or a good thing to have an easy preseason. And I first became interested in this question when I was at the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, in the capital of Australia, and I was delivering a talk at the AIS. And I asked the coaches in the room, these are all coaches of Olympians and elite athletes, do you stretch your athletes, or do you just give them sort of reasonably easy challenges much of the time that they are capable of solving so that you don't dent their confidence and so on? And there was quite a range of opinions about this. Some of them said, no, you absolutely have to challenge them because how else are they going to perform in the heat of the battle? And then others said, no, really, my job is to scaffold, to give them increasingly difficult situations, but always within their grasp so that I build them up over time. I don't want them losing confidence during that first process. And so I wanted to test that. And so one way we tested that was we looked at, I think it was about almost 20 years worth of data, looking at the preseason schedules of college basketball teams. Now, those schedules vary in terms of how challenging they are. Do you play teams that are stronger than you, teams that are weaker than you, teams that are relatively strong or weak? And what we found was a quite strong relationship that's now been replicated a few times in different studies, showing that the harder the preseason schedule, and there was no ceiling to this, harder is always better. You will see that those teams in competition later on in the season actually do better, all else being equal. And it's quite a strong effect, surprisingly strong given how many other factors you would think determine the outcome of a team's performances across the season.
As we're thinking about ways in which we get stuck, you have a section where you talk about the utility of constraints, right? That constraints can be empowering. How can this be helpful for us to think about? Yeah,
so I'm colorblind and I also paint.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I am. And I paint and draw. And some of the works that I've it's been a little while since I've done this. I'm a bit busier than I used to be, but I used to do some works that were pretty extensive and they would take me maybe a year to complete, some of them. And occasionally while doing that, I would be absolutely paralyzed by the question of what color a particular thing on the work should be. I remember being paralyzed for 2 months over the color of grass on one of the paintings. And that sounds really silly. I'm sure a lot of people can't identify with that. But what happened to me was that I, at some point, realized that probably the best thing I could do if I wanted to focus on technique and becoming a better painter was to jettison the area that was sort of extraneous, because really whether the color of grass was right or wrong, given my color blindness, wasn't central to what I was trying to achieve. It was just something that paralyzed me as a kind of extraneous feature of what I was doing. It was not useful. It was baggage. And so I simplified it by introducing the constraint that I just wouldn't use color. And that allowed me to focus on all the other elements in what I was doing. And there are so many examples of this. There's my favorite one is this painter, Phil Hansen, who was very well known for his pointillist style, where he would stab the canvas multiple times, thousands of times, creating little dots. And from afar, those dots would form into something, an image that was coherent. The problem was that at some point in his career, he developed a neurological tremor. And so those dots became what he described as tadpoles. They had little tails. And so that meant that overnight, in essence, he could no longer be a pointillist. He had to figure out what he was going to do next. And the problem with that is, if you've honed a particular style and you become good at it and it's become your trademark, and then suddenly you're told, well, you can't do that, but you've got the whole menu of every artistic style at your disposal, just do whatever you want. That's incredibly overwhelming. The absence of constraints in making that new decision to pivot is a problem. And so what he started to do, and how he eventually got unstuck, was to say, all right, well, for this artwork, I'm only going to use a 2x4 to apply paint. And for this one, I'm only going to use my feet. And for this one, I'm not going to spend more than $1. So for each successive one, he introduced incredibly tight constraints, which paradoxically loosened him up. They made it much easier for him to make progress. And often that is, again, another paradox. The best thing you can do when you are stuck is to limit your options.
Another thing we can do is to recombine. When we think about combining our ideas with other people's ideas, a first thought many people might have is, oh, well, gosh, I'm no longer being original if I'm just combining a few different things. But you point out that nothing is truly original, and that actually striving for radical originality is just a path to paralysis.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. Even the idea that nothing is original is not itself original. Other people have spoken about this before. I talk, for example, about the case of Bob Dylan. When you ask musicians who themselves are very talented, who is a truly original musician of the 20th century, I think he's the most common response. A lot of people say, there is no one quite like Dylan. But then when you dig into Dylan's past, you look at his origins, you look at where he got his start, the kinds of music he was listening to at the time, you realize, and even in his retelling, you realize how important certain branches of folk music and certain branches of pop at the time and rock at the time and blues and other branches were to informing his style. And so what we now think of as original is essentially an original recombination of these existing elements, which is true, I think, about 99.999% of products in the marketplace, ideas in the marketplace, forms of music, forms of art, forms of film. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. This idea of originality is, I think, a myth.
It's so interesting, and I guess some might be discouraged by this, but it's really quite liberating, right? To realize that it's not like there's this special class of wildly original people. It's just that we often don't know the references. We don't know from whom they have borrowed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Once you grapple with the actual conclusion that what you're doing is not about originality, it's really, really empowering, because then you can kind of make the next steps with that knowledge, and it fuels whatever you do next in a way that can be quite productive.
Another empowering notion is that expertise is great, and it's great to develop deep expertise in one or more areas that are central to what we do. But beginnerhood, the state of not having expertise at all, actually confers advantages. And we find that when we bring together teams of people, you want some amateurs, you want I guess a great example is this kind of medical crowdsourcing, right? That it's critical to have some percentage of amateurs in the mix, and that causes me to think, okay, well, if you could snap your fingers and be an expert at everything, that might actually do you a disservice when it comes to innovation and creativity.
Absolutely. I think expertise mires you in a particular way of doing things, which is very helpful if that way is undeniably the best way. But if you need to shift from that way, that can be hard to do. And so if someone came to me and said, you have infinite resources, you could do whatever you want right now, put together the best team you could for some task, there are three things that I would want in that team. I would want much of that team to be people who get along really well, who see the world the same way, who are trained quite narrowly in the thing we are trying to do. So in the case of CrowdMed, which you mentioned, this medical crowdsourcing, if I am a patient and no doctor has been able to help me, and my issue is with the kidneys, well, then I want a lot of nephrologists, kidney experts on my team. I want most of the people I'm speaking to be of that kind so that I get expertise. But I also need two other things. There are two other elements I need. One of them is non-redundant experts or non-redundant people. And non-redundancy basically means that your background, whether it's your expertise or your values or your attitudes, or it could be demographics, religion, income, whatever it is non-overlapping with the other people in the group. You may have a kidney issue, but we're going to bring sociologists and anthropologists and an expert in the brain and an expert in ankle disorders. And they might have some interesting ideas to shake things up. But then you also need a third element. You need a black sheep as well. And this comes, for example, from Pixar. Brad Bird is well known for this at Pixar. He will bring in a black sheep, and this is not just someone who's non-redundant, but someone who actively disagrees with what the essence of the group believes to be a sort of truth. So in his case, he talks about the fact that Pixar is so well known for its animations and spends so much time getting hair to look like hair and water to look like water and fur to look like fur, that sometimes they fetishize those questions and forget about the story. So he'll bring in a storyteller who says, oh, all the animation is nonsense. Who cares if you get that last mile of animation right if the story isn't an absolute killer? So let's divert 20% of our resources onto that. And so that team that is predominantly experts in the area, some non-redundant voices, and then maybe one or two black sheep, is a team that I think will never get stuck or will only get stuck briefly if it does.
Yeah, we were speaking recently with Kevin Kelly, Wired co-founder, and I'm sure you're familiar with, who has, of one of his 450 pieces of advice in his book, Excellent Advice for Living, that the act of explaining your problem to others can help you solve it. Which is an interesting perspective that perhaps part of what happens when we go and sit down with outsiders to talk through challenges and opportunities is that we re-articulate in new ways what the problem is, and that process is useful itself.
Yeah, it's funny. I have some research from quite a while ago now with my then advisor as a graduate student, Danny Oppenheimer. We were investigating this idea known as the illusion of explanatory depth. And it's this phenomenon where if I said to you, for example, how well can you explain how a bicycle works?
Yeah.
Well, you know what a bicycle is. And so most people say, oh, yeah, I get it. It's probably a 7 or an 8 out of 10. And then I say, all right, tell me about the parts of a bicycle and how they interact with each other. And I should be able to build a bicycle from scratch based on the fact that you just said you understand it at an 8 or 9 out of 10. And as soon as you push people to explain, every little thing they don't understand is magnified, and then they say, well, I guess I didn't really understand it. I couldn't draw a bicycle. If you gave me the pieces, I'm not sure I could put it together. I guess I'm actually at a 3 or a 4 out of 10. So it's consistent with what Kevin Kelly was saying there, that by explaining your ideas, by being forced to articulate what you're thinking, it magnifies what you don't know and the bits that are still uncertain and that need perhaps a bit more fleshing out.
Well, and if other people aren't available, it turns out that we can actually get a lot of benefit from discussing our problems with ourselves.
Right.
Right. But particularly if we do it the right way. And I absolutely love this study that had people have conversations in virtual reality with an avatar of Sigmund Freud. It was really remarkable.
Yeah. So the study with Sigmund Freud was people who were trying to coach themselves through a point where they felt stuck in some psychological distress. Was that they were having this discussion with a Sigmund Freud avatar that was giving them advice, or they could have a discussion with an avatar that was made to look like themselves, giving themselves advice as themselves. And the big idea here is that within you, there are multiple opinions about any topic. You'll have an instinctive, intuitive opinion. That'll be your first idea about something. But if you say to yourself, okay, let's imagine that intuition is totally wrong. How could I be wrong? And if I'm wrong, what would be the next best way of understanding this problem? And so there what you have is essentially you've made your own black sheep out of your own brain. And so there's going to be a midpoint between those two positions, your intuitions and the reconsideration, that will probably do a better job of capturing the true direction you should follow than that single intuition alone. And that's what a lot of research has found.
It's fantastic. And it's it's much less expensive than talking with consultants or experts
It
on the
is.
outside to have conversation with yourself. And apparently it really can be highly effective. Reading is a form of meditation that makes you smarter. It's a radical act of patience in this frenetic, tech-addicted world we all live in. And the data shows reading is a kind of miracle drug. It reduces stress, increases motivation, improves sleep. It's correlated with more success, higher income. And books don't run out of batteries. But what to read? We at the Next Big Idea Club can help you with that. You've heard about our app, which provides daily book summaries from the authors themselves, but have you heard about our box subscription? Go to nextbigideaclub.com to learn all about it. Here's the short version. Sign up for a Next Big Idea Club hardcover box subscription, and you will get 4 boxes per year, each containing 2 books, that's 8 books per year, and not just any books, the best books of the season, according to our 4 legendary curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Susan Cain, Daniel Pink, and Adam Grant. Plus, we discuss the books with the authors and distill them into exclusive audio e-courses. Go to nextbigideaclub.com and become a member of our growing community. So I love this distinction between exploring and exploiting. To me, it's a very useful way to think about the process of innovation and driving forward towards our objectives. How do you think about that?
It's grounded in our evolutionary past as a species. So if you imagine hunting and gathering and looking for food on the savannah in a very stereotypical way, you have 2 basic choices. You can go and roam as much territory as possible, but that means doing a pretty shallow job of exploring it for everything that's there. Or what you can do is you can say, well, I have a pretty good sense that there's this one little patch of terrain over there that's going to be very fruitful. I'm going to expend all my effort making the most of that terrain. I'm going to dig very deeply. I'm going to leave no blade of grass unturned. And so those are the 2 approaches. The first one, where you use breadth, is exploring. And the second one, where you look deeply and you really exploit, is known as exploitation. And the big idea is that you can't do both at the same time. You have to choose which strategy is best at any point in time. And what researchers have found for innovation and also for the health or good of careers in general, if you look across the course of an entire career, is that what you need to do is strategically explore first. In other words, be open to new ideas. Say yes to every opportunity that comes your way. Be receptive. Try new things. So in the case of Jackson Pollock, the painter, there was a period of time where Pollock tried a whole range of different techniques. He wasn't wedded to any one technique. And he was exploring. He was figuring out what worked best for him. But there was a moment where he said, you know what, it turns out there's something new about this new technique that I really like, this drip technique, where I throw paint at the canvas in these vertical lines. I think I want to exploit that. So he changed the switch from yes to no. Instead of saying yes to every opportunity, he said basically no to everything except what he was singularly focused on, which in that moment was making the very most of this new technique of drip painting. And that's the exploitation phase. And so you see across careers that the hot streaks in careers, the periods of great growth and productivity and, the really innovative work that people do tends to be after they have explored and then switched at the right moment to exploitation mode. And you can go jump back and forth throughout your career, but for any sort of chunk of time, you need to explore first, but you can't explore endlessly because you'll never really make much progress. You've then got to switch into exploit mode. And it's a really useful framework for productivity and for work in general.
Yeah, I guess this notion that one would cycle through periods of exploring and exploiting would seem to align well with the plateau effect, right? That you figure something out that's working, and that yields incredible results until it doesn't. Right, that there's an erosion, diminishing returns, and then it's time to go back, perhaps, and explore further.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Is you've got to know when to switch between exploring and exploiting, and it works both ways, right? You've got to know that, hey, I've been saying yes to everything for a very long time. How do I know when it's time to actually focus? And then at the end of that, as you say, that period of exploitation, you're going to hit the plateau eventually and have to do something new and pivot. And so you've got to know to switch back to exploring.
You end the book with a chapter that's effectively about the power of a bias for action. Action above all. We should take action. And I imagine that part of what is so troubling about being stuck is that we're not acting often, right? And moving forward, taking action is a critical part of what we need to do to get out of those situations.
Absolutely, yeah. So all this discussion about how you deal with the emotional consequences of being stuck and all the questions about the best strategy for getting unstuck, all of that is essentially in the service of action. Because until you act, until you do something, you're going to remain stuck. So you have to do to get unstuck. So on one level, doing is important because it's the thing that will get you unstuck. But it's also important psychologically because when you start doing something, you lubricate the wheels in motion in the right direction. That tends to unstick you further. So I love this description that comes from Jeff Tweedy, the front man of Wilco. He writes music, but he also writes books. So he's a real creative Renaissance man. But he talks about the fact that if you, for decades, wake up in the morning and have to be creative, that's asking a lot of yourself. And so you've got to get the wheels turning. How do you do that? And he basically says that what he'll do in the morning, because he privileges action instead of just sitting around and, strategizing, he will lower his standards down to the ground, where he'll say to himself, what I'm going to do now is come up with the very worst sentence I can come up with. And now I'm going to write that down. Or I'm going to write the worst phrase of music I can and then see where I get. And he'll do this for a little bit of time. And what he says, that's pouring out the bad ideas to make room for the good. That's the metaphor he uses, which I think is really quite powerful. And once he's done that, because he's spent the last, say, 15, 20 minutes doing, even if the products of that doing are not useful, although sometimes they are more useful than he imagines, he's moving in the right direction. He's loosened things up enough that he can start doing the work that he's actually trying to do. And so that's, I think, very valuable advice. The basic idea is it actually doesn't matter what you do, but to get unstuck, the first thing is do something.
I love this notion of pouring out the bad ideas to remove them from clogging
Exactly.
the spout, as it were. And you say the more ideas you have, the higher their quality will tend to be, which is counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also goes back to that idea that we discussed about the creative cliff, that the first ideas are probably not going to be your best ones, even if they tumble out easily and even if they come to mind without much difficulty, they're probably not going to be all that original or interesting. And so over time, the more ideas you have, the more you struggle against whatever it is that's causing blocks and making it hard for successive ideas to emerge. That's when the good ones come out. Also, there's a sense in which if you have 100 ideas, it's a little bit hard to know if one of them is going to be a golden idea. We don't know with certainty whether the best idea will be idea number 3, number 12, number 27, or number 99. But if you always go through the motions of creating all 100 ideas, it'll be in there somewhere. Whereas if you'd stopped earlier, you might exclude the possibility of finding that good idea down the line. And there's a lot of evidence of that, again, from careers, that it's very hard to predict when in a career a golden period will happen. There's a great study that looks at this. They look at people like writers, and they say, well, they identify writers who had the golden period of their careers really early on. Like they wrote a great first book and then never did anything else. Other writers just kept going and wrote some, modestly successful books and then had some great hit in their 80s or their 90s. And then there are some people who had a great hit in the middle part of their careers. And it's hard to predict which one you will be. And also, sometimes there are more than one. You can have multiple great periods. But the point is, if you don't stick it out till the very end, you don't know when that next great period will come. But there definitely won't be a great period if you don't continue, if you stop.
I think as we talk about golden periods in one's career, I think you're in one right now, Adam, because
Thank you.
It's really a fantastic book. I'm so excited for you just coming out what will be this week when people get to hear it. Congratulations, and thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rufus. I appreciate it.
And if you're trying to paint a picture, but you're not sure which colors belong, just paint what you see, don't let anyone say it's wrong. And if you're strung out like a kite, or stung awake in the night, it's alright to be frightened when There's a light, what light? There's a light, what light? There's a light, white light inside of you.
Adam Alter's new book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough, How to Get Unstuck When It Matters Most, is out now. Adam also made a book bite for it. This is an audio summary of the book's 5 key insights, and it's only available in the Next Big Idea app, which you can download right now by going to your app store and searching for Next Big Idea. If you like this show, here's something that would really help us out. Share it with a friend, maybe someone who's a little bit stuck. We'd also love it if you'd subscribe to our newsletter, where I share my personal musings on each week's episodes. To subscribe, search for me, Rufus Griscom, on LinkedIn, or follow the link in the episode notes. Today's show was produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound designed by Mike Toda. The team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network makes sure we never get stuck. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.